Homer's Odyssey. It stands as one of the foundational stories of Western literature, an epic tale spanning 10 years, in which a hero journeys across seas and through myth, contending with gods, monsters, and the limits of human endurance. But what happens when this epic framework is radically compressed? When the vast oceans of the Mediterranean are reduced to the streets of a single city, and the decade-long struggle of a legendary warrior is recast as the movements of an ordinary man over the course of one single day. This is the premise of James Joyce's Ulysses. Set in Dublin on June 16th in 1904, the novel reimagines the structure of the Homeric epic with the confines of everyday life. Its protagonist, Leopold Bloom, doesn't go on any grand voyage. Instead, he just moves through the ordinary spaces of the city, and he attends a funeral, he does some small errands, and he drinks inside pubs and bars and wanders through the streets. All of this he does to postpone his return home. So the epic has been really stripped away. But Joyce is also making an argument that the ordinary is not the opposite of the epic, but actually how a single day, attentively rendered, can contain the complexity of an entire lifetime, and how the people that we encounter along the way participate in shaping our understanding of who we are. Let's go back to the start, where to actually begin with this massive book. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the book, to be honest, in one sense that I loved almost all of it, but there were also parts which were just a little bit too out there for me. The book is loaded with allusions to other works, other authors and poets and philosophers, and I really liked that. And being a big fan of Homer's The Odyssey, I really enjoyed the Homeric structure, although some episodes are obviously more connected to the story of Homer, and some of them are a little bit more tenuously connected than others. I've also read Dante and a number of Shakespeare's works, other poems by Blake and Dickens. I think really Joyce is writing it to book nerds like me and like you, who have probably read those authors and read those stories. But why do people read this book? And why did I read this book? Why? Why did I choose this book that is infamously difficult and hard to read? Well, let's find out. First published in its complete form in 1922, the novel represents one of the most ambitious and fully realized expressions of modernist aesthetics. Joyce began composing Ulysses in 1914 while still living in continental Europe, having left Ireland 2 years earlier. The novel was initially published in serialized form between 1918 and 1920 in the American literary magazine The Little Review. This early publication, however, quickly attracted legal scrutiny. Several episodes, most notably Nausicaa, with its frank treatment of sexuality, were deemed obscene under contemporary standards. So in 1921, the editors of the Little Review were prosecuted and the serialization was halted. And as a result, Ulysses first appeared in its complete form, not in the English-speaking world, but first in Paris. It was published in 1922 by Sylvia Beach, the owner of the bookshop called Shakespeare and Company, who recognized both the significance of the work and the improbability that it would be published elsewhere. Even then, the novel remained banned in America and the United Kingdom for over a decade, circulating primarily through private editions or smuggled copies. And at the same time, its experimental form posed a challenge not only to moral conventions, but to the very expectations of what a novel should actually be. The fragmentation of style, the absence of a singular narrative voice, and the refusal to prioritize plot over perception all contributed to its reputation as this really difficult text. It reflects Joyce's attempt to construct a literary form adequate to the conditions of modernity, a form capable of accommodating multiplicity and contradiction and the ceaseless flow of consciousness. The opening section of Ulysses is often referred to as the Telemachia, which is broken into 3 episodes, the first 3 chapters being called Telemachus, Nestor, and Proteus. Episode 1, the first one, Telemachus, is where we are introduced to Stephen, and he is living in a real tower, a real place in Ireland called Martello Tower, with 2 other people, Buck Mulligan and a man called Hines. Mulligan is this irreverent and mocking and somewhat cruel individual who teases Stephen about his ideas on Shakespeare and his Irish guilt as well. Stephen is refusing to pray at his mother's deathbed. He feels alienated, financially dependent, and symbolically dispossessed. Then in the second chapter, Nestor, Stephen goes to the school where he teaches history and later speaks with the headmaster, Mr. Odyyssey. The conversation touches on history and money and Irish identity, and this is also where we get Stephen reflecting that history is a nightmare from which he is trying to awake. And then episode 3, Proteus. This is apparently what breaks a few readers, and they decide to bail on it at this stage, but some persevere, of course. Stephen here walks along Sandymount Strand, engaging in dense, introspective thought. This episode has minimal external action, but rich in internal movement. Philosophy, memory, perception, language itself become the subject. Ineluctable modality of the visible, at least, if no more, thought through my eyes. Signatures of all things I am here to read, sea spawn and sea wrack, the nearing tide, that rusty boot, snot green, blue silver, rust, coloured signs, limits of the diaphane. And it breaks readers because Joyce early on is already introducing us to a new literary aesthetic, a new technique, the stream of consciousness, especially in third part, Proteus. The thoughts are non-linear, they are associative and really, really disjointed and fragmented, a bit random. Sentences don't even end sometimes before going on to the next idea. This technique, of course, breaks from traditional narration, trying to mimic the real cognitive process, and forces the reader to actively interpret the meaning as well. Joyce is also already giving us lots of allusions to other works and lots of intertextuality. The Telemachia is saturated with references. Of course, we have Homer's Odyssey, number 1. Stephen is basically representing Telemachus, the son searching for identity or searching for the father-like figure. And there is philosophical and literary laying with Shakespeare and Aristotle and Aquinas as well, plus the religious imagery associated with Catholic guilt and ritual and rebellion. The focus then shifts to Leopold Bloom, our tragic hero, whose movements constitute the central body of the novel. Bloomsday begins at home, where he prepares breakfast and attends small domestic routines before setting out into the city. From this point onward, the narrative follows his progress through a series of loosely connected episodes. He collects a letter, he attends a funeral of an acquaintance, conducts business, eats, he observes, and engages in intermittent conversation. These actions, taken individually, possess little inherent dramatic weight. But throughout the day, there is a subtle tension that underlies Bloom's movements. Early on, we are given the idea that he is aware that his wife, Molly, is actually engaged in an affair, and he anticipates that she will meet her lover, called Blazes Boylan, that same afternoon. This knowledge shapes his trajectory through the city, not by prompting decisive action, but by actually encouraging delay. Bloom's wanderings can then be understood as part of an act of avoidance or a deferral of the moment of return. Does that sound like Homer's Odyssey? No, not quite, because in contrast to the teleological drive of traditional epic, in which the hero is actually striving toward a clear objective, Odysseus' 10-year journey back home to his wife Penelope, Bloom's journey, however, is marked by hesitation and digression. The novel's final movement brings Bloom into contact with Stephen, whose own wandering has led him into a state of increasing disorientation. Basically, we have Bloom, who is Odysseus, and we have Dedalus, who is Telemachus, and their story threads are crisscrossed, and then they do finally meet towards the end. Their encounter, though brief and inconclusive, introduces the possibility of a connection across generational and psychological divides. Bloom offers Stephen a form of quiet hospitality, and for a short time their trajectories converge. Yet this convergence does not culminate in any resolution. Stephen ultimately eventually departs, and Bloom does return home alone. There are 18 episodes broken down into 3 parts, and the final part has 3 chapters. This closing episode, centered completely on Molly Bloom, reconfigures the narrative once again, in contrast to the preceding sections, which balance external action and interior reflection. Penelope consists entirely of Molly's uninterrupted stream of consciousness, one long sentence. Through her recollections and associations, the events of the day are retrospectively reframed, and the novel concludes not with a definitive resolution, but with a sustained affirmation of experience itself. So I think in this sense, the novel's point is not the plot, or the novel's plot is not necessarily the story of what happens, but is actually of how life is lived. It's lived moment by moment, or person by person, thought by thought, with the confines of time and space and one's self-awareness. Does that sound fun to you? One of the most helpful ways to understand the middle part of Ulysses isn't just by looking at what actually happens, but by looking at how Joyce is writing each chapter and how that gradually becomes more and more difficult. He starts you off in something that feels almost familiar, and then chapter by chapter, he pushes the form further and further until by the end, you're reading something that barely resembles a traditional story at all. By the way, I wasn't exactly being facetious when I said that this book gave me a headache, because in all honesty, it really did. But the fault was not with the book, and I cannot blame James Joyce. The fault was with me, because I'm stupid. Basically, the book is divided into 18 chapters, or 18 episodes, and the chapter titles are listed in the chart at the front of the book, with 18 of them here, things like Cyclops and Nausicaa, Oxen of the Sun and Circe, etc. But within the pages of the book itself, the chapter titles aren't there. So you sort of have to go back to refer to where you are in the book to know exactly which chapter you're on. For whatever reason, I forgot where I was, or I thought I was a little bit further than I thought. And I thought I had reached a chapter called Aimaeus, but I wasn't there yet. I was actually on a chapter called Oxen of the Sun. Oxen of the Sun is actually one of the more challenging chapters, because the technique it uses is Old English, almost biblical English. And I was really struggling to understand what was happening within that chapter. So I went for some guidance and for help and so I looked online for some context and a bit of a summary about what was happening. So obviously, the more they were describing about Aimaeus, the more confused I became, because it was nothing like what I was reading about. They were describing Leopold Bloom and Dedalus going to a shelter. They explained that Dedalus had just been punched in the face, and there was actually James Joyce having fun with language and using these old cliches and writing as if he was a bad writer. And the more they explained about that chapter, I thought there was just something completely wrong with my brain, because it was just nothing that I was reading about here. I was looking back and forth in the pages thinking, where is this happening in this chapter? So it was a bit of a relief when I realized that I was just looking up the wrong chapter, and I wasn't actually on Aimaeus yet at all. I was still on Oxen of the Sun. Oxen of the Sun just being a really hard chapter. Still, good to know there was nothing wrong with my brain that I know of. And part 2 starts, I'll just check the chart. Yes, part 2 starts with Calypso, where we first properly meet Leopold Bloom. The writing is actually quite accessible here. It is still close to realism. We follow his morning routine and we understand what's happening, and his thoughts are there, but they're easy to follow. It still feels quite grounded and quite physical and quite clear. That continues into Hades, where Bloom attends a funeral and he is walking through the city streets behind the hearse. In the Odyssey, by comparison, this is where Odysseus is traveling to the underworld. Then, in Lotus Eaters, things start to feel a little bit more different. We introduce more to the city and its people, and just like in Homer's Odyssey, this is where Odysseus's crew have go onto their island, and everyone's really kind of doped up on eating these lotuses, and they're all really dulled and fatigued, and everything's kind of slowed down. By comparison, in Ulysses, Bloom is sober and he's traveling through the city, and we're getting these little stories about the people there. So by the time we get to the next chapter, the Laestygonians, the shift becomes again even more pronounced. The chapter is driven by Bloom's sensation, particularly hunger and appetite, and the narrative is shaped less by what Bloom is doing and more by how he experiences. The infamous stream of consciousness is more and more pronounced here, and the language is more fragmented, broken, and random. Then Joyce is really starting to experiment and play with language more and more, because in the next chapter, Aeolus, this is where the chapter is broken up by newspaper-style headlines. These constantly interrupt the flow and make the narrative feel really fragmented and performative. That idea of fragmentation expands even further in Wandering Rocks, but actually I really quite enjoyed this chapter where the novel moves between multiple characters across Dublin. Joyce is basically telling us about these characters, little anecdotes, these little flavors of the city that shape the city, and we're reading about different lives, how they intersect briefly and loosely without any clear narrative thread to hold on to. Then in Sirens, Joyce does something remarkable. Sirens is probably one of the most famous chapters in the book. The writing becomes musical. Rhythm and repetition and sound take over. Meaning isn't just what is being said, but in also how it sounds. Joyce is taking words to a new realm, the realm of music and musical composition, where words repeat and accrue meaning across the chapter. Chips, picking chips off rocky thumbnail, chips, horrid, and gold flushed more, a husky fife note blue, blue bloom is on the gold pinnacled hair, a jumping rose on satiny breasts of satin, rose of Castile, trilling, I Dolores, peep, who's in the peep of gold? Tink cried to bronze in pity. And the Cyclops makes an appearance in Joyce's Ulysses too. Naturally, the difficulty shifts again. Joyce is playing with parody. The narrative voice constantly changes, moving between ordinary speech and exaggerated speech, almost ridiculous epic language. This is like deliberately unstable, and you're forced to keep adjusting as a reader. For any fans of Shakespeare, you're more likely to enjoy this next chapter. It's quite a big one. It is Schuyler and Charybdis, and the chapter becomes really insightful and intellectual. We return to Stephen Dedalus, and the chapter is dominated by this really dense discussion of Shakespeare. This is where we also learn about Daedalus's theory of Hamlet, where he has apparently proven by algebra that Hamlet's grandson is Shakespeare's grandfather, and that he himself is the ghost of his own father. I like this chapter a lot. You're basically listening in on someone's theory, someone's discussion. It's almost like a lecture that you're involved with about Shakespeare, about theory of his plays, about how Shakespeare is actually maybe in some of his own stories, and how beside God, after God, only Shakespeare has created more. So I liked that chapter, and then I really liked the chapter following that as well, which is Nausicaa. By comparison to others, I would argue that it's one of the more easier ones to get through. Joyce is setting you up with a style that feels a little bit more like romantic fiction. It is soft and maybe a bit sentimental, as we see a young lady on the beach sort of flirting with Bloom as he is seen watching her from afar, and she is aware of him, and she sort of deliberately shows more and more of her stockings for a bit of a thrill. But then the sentimental then abruptly undercut by revealing that this is actually happening from Bloom's perspective. The contrast then exposes how artificial that earlier style really was. So it was going quite well at that point. I was enjoying it. Then I started reading Oxen of the Sun. This is one of the most ambitious chapters in the book, the one that gave me the headache. The language itself evolves through the history of English, starting with older forms and gradually becoming more and more modern, and even using slang at the end of the chapter, quite chaotic towards the end. Joyce uses poetic tradition, old church sermons, parts that read like Latin translations, parts that read like you're reading the Bible, and there are allusions to Defoe and Dickens and a whole myriad of other people. The technique is that of embryonic development. Yeah. So it mirrors the theme of childbirth, as Bloom in the story is visiting his friend in hospital while she's in labor. But it also makes the reading experience increasingly painful to read as well, like birth. And as the episode ends, Bloom leaves the hospital and goes to a bar where he has some absinthe, and there is this sound or this text which just keeps interrupting the text as well, which is a bit like a flaup, something like that. And it could be interpreted as a hiccup or someone being sick, maybe Bloom starting to feel a bit nauseous, or it could be the sound of a newborn baby making those sounds. So yeah, you can see why it gave me a headache. And then when I finished that chapter, I thought, hurrah, that's great. I can now move on to the next one, almost at the end of part 2. I was wrong, because then we get to Circe. I think it's pronounced Circe. I don't know if it's Cirque or Kirk or Circe. I'm not sure. Let me know in the comments. But this is really where everything starts falling apart. It's a long one as well. Definitely the longest chapter in the whole book. I think it's over 100 pages. And the chapter is written as a play. And you think, oh, that's great. I can read plays. Easy. This has stage directions and dialogue. But the problem is that 90% of this chapter is all hallucinatory. It's a hallucination. And everything that has been internal before, the fears and desires and anxieties, they have suddenly become externalized. And it's really surreal and disorientating, and definitely the most challenging part of the novel. Everyone who we've come across so far in the story makes an appearance in this hallucination, and basically Bloom is still wandering the streets, and it's now late and dark, and because of the absinthe, things start to take on more of a bit of a sinister turn. Everything looks a little bit more frightening to him, like the tram tracks turn skeletal, and he sees some children who are just eating ice cream over the street, but he's basically having a bit of a bad trip. And he feels guilty for buying some meat from the butcher's, and then he meets the ghost of his father, hello Hamlet, and he basically says, why do you spend so much money on this meat? And Bloom agrees, so he gives the meat to the dogs. Then he thinks he gets arrested by these night watchmen, and he's suddenly taken to court, and he's on trial, and all these people keep coming, all these witnesses, and it's all a bit of a hot mess. Yeah, it's mad. Nice way to end part 2. But they say once you reach part 3, it's all plain sailing. Part 3, referred to as the Nostos, the homecoming, is much quieter and more reflective. And after all this stylistic experimentation, in the middle of the novel, things begin to finally slow down. In Aeneas, Bloom and Stephen are finally together, but the energy is low. Joyce again is kind of using language to reflect how the characters are feeling in the story. The writing itself feels tired and slightly awkward, a bit meandering, which reflects the characters' exhaustion. Nothing dramatic is happening. Instead, we get a sense of drifting conversation and a kind of fragile connection between them. Joyce is taking on the role of a different writer, a bad writer, apparently, who uses cliche and clumsy writing to express the fatigue and tiredness of the characters. Then, in Ithaca, Joyce shifts style, this time into a strict question and answer format. Feels almost scientific, it's precise and controlled, as everything that Bloom does is broken down and analysed. But underneath that structure, there's something quite human also going on. And there's a brief sense of companionship between them, maybe even this kind of father and son dynamic, but it doesn't quite last. Stephen leaves and the moment passes. Then finally in Penelope, we move entirely into Molly Bloom's mind in one long, unbroken flow of thought. There's no punctuation, no structure, just her voice. It's direct and emotional and grounded in memory and relationships and the body. And after all the complexity of the novel, it feels surprisingly clear and human. And it ends with that final line, the famous line, yes, I said yes, I will, yes. It's simple and powerful, and to be honest, quite the reward to the reader after battling this mammoth text. Whew. So I asked at the start why people read this book, and why did I read this book? Well, I read it for a challenge, and if you ever come across any lists of top 10 greatest books of all time, Ulysses will undoubtedly be featured, even perhaps as number one. I have read it now, and I am glad to have read it. Is it hard? Yes. I said yes. Is it challenging? Yes. Is it annoying? Yes. But is it also brilliant? Yes. It is a masterpiece. It is art. It is a writer experimenting with language. It is funny. It is playful. It is unique. But it's also full of fantastic language and quotes. It's profound. There are parts of it which really just make you kind of sit back and think, wow, that was a beautiful piece of language, or what a really, really well constructed piece of prose. I think it's clever how Joyce is playing with language to reflect someone's mood or emotion, or how he's making people think about music and rhythm and the evolution of language. How he brings up discussions of Shakespeare and Dante and all these other poets and art and literature. It's jam-packed with all of these fantastic allusions and references. So for anybody who is, like me, a bit of a nerd of books, just loves stories and loves books and authors, then you should give this a shot. It's worth bearing with. There are parts which really do drag. Well, I wouldn't say drag. There are parts which are quite heavy, and I did actually have to keep checking the chart at the start, and to be honest, I even had to check a few summaries online, which do a much better job than I do in my video. So I hope I haven't put you off reading James Joyce. It is definitely worth a read, and if you liked this video, please again like and subscribe to my channel, and as always, I look forward to seeing you again soon for more book talk. See you.